Now, I want to go to your speech in the Senate this week talking about some transgender issues. This is a fraught area. People who weigh in here can get pilloried. Just ask J.K. Rowling. I'll come to her in a moment. But you've focused on women's sport. First up, a real concern here for women and for the mothers of girls, the parents of girls, coming up against transgender athletes, just whether there's any fairness in the competition, and then there are other issues like sharing facilities and the like.
Yeah, so about 12 months ago, Chris, I received an onslaught of correspondence from constituents, both in Tasmania and across the country, around a set of transgender inclusion guidelines that Sport Australia had issued not long before then. And the concern that these people, generally women, but men too, had was that young girls and women were going to be disadvantaged in terms of their sporting experience. And that ranges from disadvantage at their local sporting club, where young girls might want to feel looked after and fostered and safe in a sporting environment, and may not necessarily feel that way if they're required to play sport against boys that perhaps identified as being female, right up to the professional level, where we see Tamsin Lewis, an Australian athlete, an Australian Olympian, vocalising her concerns only a few months ago that this whole transgender debate as it relates to sport will disadvantage women. I mean, no Australian would want to see an Australian woman go to the Olympics and lose out on a medal because she's been competing against a man who is transitioning to being a woman and who now has a natural competitive strength advantage over her. So this is a massive concern across Australia, and I've had countless pieces of correspondence from constituents and great feedback actually following the speech I gave to the Senate this week.
Yeah, look, it's an important issue and no one wants to see disadvantage here. But the other issue is no one, of course, wants to see any trans people discriminated against or unfairly pilloried, yet there are legitimate concerns, aren't there, in terms of sharing facilities as we deal with some of these trans issues outside of sport. It can be sporting facilities, of course, change rooms and the like, but there's the issue of trans criminals being sent to female prisons and the like. Are we getting any further down the path to sort of getting some definitions around this, some rules in place, or is it pretty much case by case that we're dealing with this at the moment?
Look, it does seem to be case by case, but I would certainly like to see a bit more clarity around this area. And unfortunately, it's my view that having these transgender guidelines in the sporting arena, which were designed to clarify the issue, have just confused sporting organisations even further. Particularly as it relates to women's sport. I mean, there has to be a question of, yes, of course, transgender people should be able to play sport, but that shouldn't be to the detriment of women who, for very appropriate common sense reasons, should be able to play sport within their own sex if that's what they so choose to do. So I'd certainly like to see some more clarity on this issue into the future. And I'll be continuing to raise questions with Sport Australia and the Australian Human Rights Commission, which were the two organisations that developed these guidelines at estimates, just as I did back in February. I must say back then I wasn't particularly happy with the responses I received from Sport Australia at the time. They weren't particularly clear on their policy on women's sport and whether or not women's sport should be for women, which I thought was quite frankly shocking from Australia's peak sporting organisation body. So certainly let's try and get some clarity around these issues, and I'll continue to fight for that.
Yeah, good on you. As you say, a lot of people are interested in this. People want some sensible outcomes and some clarity. Just finally and quickly, are you ever a little bit nervous, trepidatious getting into an area like this when you see someone like J.K. Rowling and the way that the world can descend upon them for daring to share some common sense views?
Look, looking at what J.K. Rowling has gone through over the last fortnight, I can certainly understand why some women feel scared to speak out about this issue. And some of the feedback I've received since my speech in the Senate from women has said, you know, I am concerned about speaking out on this myself because I don't want to be, subjected to that sort of harassment in whatever forum. But I mean, we also have to remember Twitter isn't the real world,
exactly,
as much as some might like to think it is. And out there in the real world, in the community across Australia, I don't think anyone would really question the concept that women's sport should be for women. So it certainly wasn't with any sort of fear in mind that I took the lectern in the Senate earlier this week to make this speech. But like I say, I can understand why some women feel that way.
Senator, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Senator Claire Chandler there. It's a fraud issue and nobody wants to discriminate against trans people, but there are real issues here, particularly for women's sport.